There is a particular kind of place that inspires no legends of its own. No Titan watchers slumber beneath its soil. No ancient curse lingers in its trees. No world-shaping artifact was buried here in an age before memory. If one were to open the great catalogues of Azeroth's wonders, and I have spent more years than I care to count doing precisely that, the forests and valleys and open roads of Elwynn would not fill many pages. They would not need to. The land is gentle, the rivers run clear, the fields are farmed by people whose names will never be inscribed in stone. And yet, I have read accounts of soldiers who wept when the gates of Stormwind first came into view after years of exile. Men and women who had crossed frozen tundra, who had walked through plague and fire and the silence that follows catastrophe, who had not wept at any of it, and who wept here at the sight of a watchtower and a familiar road. I have read letters recovered from the Second War, written by soldiers who knew they would not survive their next engagement, and who asked not for recognition, not for justice, not even for victory, but simply to be remembered as someone who had once sat beside the mill at Northshire, someone who had once known what home felt like. That is not the language of strategic importance. It is not the language of destiny or divine selection. It is something quieter, and, I have come to believe, something far more difficult to account for. The great conflicts of this world have always produced their share of heroism in service of power, of bloodshed in defense of thrones. But there is another kind of sacrifice, less celebrated, harder to name, that has nothing to do with power at all. It is the willingness to bleed for a road you have walked so many times that you no longer notice you are walking it. What gives an ordinary place extraordinary meaning? My name is Aldrich. I have served as chronicler and keeper of records for longer than is perhaps dignified, and in that time I have walked the ruins of Lordaeron, catalogued the inscriptions of Uldaman, and stood at the edge of places so old that human language has no adequate word for them. I have recorded histories that no living soul witnessed. I have pieced together the architecture of forgotten civilizations from the angle of a fallen column and the particular way a threshold stone wears when 10,000 feet have crossed it in the same direction. But I keep returning to Elwynn, not for what it contains in terms of the remarkable, for what it reveals about the nature of meaning itself. The land offers few dramatic introductions. Elwynn Forest is, by most physical measures, modest. A temperate woodland in the heart of the eastern kingdoms, nestled below the foothills of the Burning Steppes to the north, with the Red Ridge Mountains rising to the east. To the west lie the dry, open plains of Westfall, and to the south, across the Nasferiti River, the shadows begin to deepen toward Duskwood. Stormwind City sits proudly in the northwestern hills of the region, its gates opening down onto the forest. East of the city, behind a thick wall, lies the peaceful Northshire Valley. Crystal Lake sits further in the forest's reaches, quiet and cold beneath the canopy. The road from Northshire Abbey to the city's gates is paved stone, worn smooth by the passage of 10,000 ordinary feet over generations. There are no monuments along that road, no shrines to mark where history pivoted. It is simply a road, and the fact that it is simply a road is, I think, the beginning of what needs to be understood. There is a specific quality to land that has been farmed for generations, not farmed to exhaustion, as happened to much of Westfall, but tended with the kind of continuity that accumulates slowly into something that might be called wisdom in the soil. The fields around Goldshire, the Stonefield Farm, and McClure Vineyards in the south, the Brackwell pumpkin patch visible from the road at the right time of year, they carry the particular warmth of land that has been understood by its occupants, not conquered, not extracted from, understood. The McClure Vineyards have maintained their claim to a particular hillside in the south of the region for as long as anyone with access to records can trace. The precise origins of the family's claim are not documented with any great precision. Such things rarely are when the people who establish them are farmers rather than lords. But given what we know of the region's settlement patterns, it seems fair to say the family was working that land before the great structures of the city above had taken their current form. The vineyards are simply there, in the way that things are there when they have been there long enough to stop being noticed. That kind of rootedness is not incidental detail. It is, in many ways, the whole argument. Stormwind was not chosen as a seat of human power because the land was strategically irreplaceable, though it is defensible enough, positioned on elevated ground with access to passages that could be held. It was not chosen because the soil was uniquely fertile above all other regions, though the farming communities here have never lacked for sustenance. The lore of the kingdom's founding tells us that it grew from descendants of the Arathi bloodline who migrated south from the old empire of Arathor, led, according to the records, by a man named Faldir, a member of Thoradin's own line. They had left the fractured remnants of Arathor behind, traveled past the rocky mountains of Cosmodan, and settled at last in a fertile valley in the continent they would name Azeroth. What they built there became, over 1,200 years, a self-sufficient kingdom, one of the smallest and most isolated of the human nations, the records say, one of the most prosperous in the end, because it measured prosperity in farmsteads rather than conquest. This matters more than it might appear at first consideration. A kingdom built around a place of power, a ley nexus, a titan installation, a fortress raised to control a mountain pass, carries within it the logic of the site. It exists to guard something, to project something outward, to hold something that cannot be allowed to fall into other hands. But a kingdom that grows from a community of farmers and craftspeople and ordinary settlers carries a fundamentally different logic. It exists because the people who built it needed somewhere to be. The city did not create the community. The community, slowly and without ceremony, created the city. That distinction runs like a fault line beneath everything that would later happen to this land. The losing of it, the long exile, the desperate and costly work of taking it back. Because you do not sacrifice to reclaim a strategic position. You sacrifice to reclaim a place that knew you. The logic of defense here was never military at its core. It was something more personal and therefore more absolute. The First War began with the opening of the dark portal in the Blasted Lands, a place so far removed from Elwyn's pastoral rhythms that it might as well have been another world. For a time, it was. The initial horde campaigns moved through the southern reaches of the eastern kingdoms with a brutality that the early commanders of Stormwind were unprepared to meet, not because they lacked courage or numbers, but because they were encountering something for which no existing framework of warfare had prepared them. The Horde was not a kingdom seeking territorial advantage. It did not negotiate from recognized positions within a shared political order. It came with a different purpose, and it took time, costly time, for those defending the region to understand that the rules they had learned would not apply. By the time it became clear that Stormwind itself might fall, the question was no longer military. It had become something more elemental. The records from that period are fragmentary in the way records always are when the people keeping them were simultaneously fleeing for their lives. What survives is a composite portrait of evacuation and loss. Civilians moving north toward Lordaeron, children separated from families in the chaos of retreat, soldiers holding rearguard positions on roads they had walked every day of their lives, watching the smoke rise behind them from places they could name without looking. The mill at Northshire, the Lion's Pride Inn, the road through Goldshire. Much of the forest was burned as the horde marched across Elwynn. Goldshire destroyed, Northshire Abbey itself laid low. The Stormreaver and Twilight's Hammer clans took domains in the forest after the city fell. King Llane Wrynn did not survive it. He was assassinated in the fall of Stormwind, murdered by Garona Halforsen, and his son, the young Prince Varian, witnessed it. Varian was a boy of 10 when the war began, and 13 when he watched his father die. It was Anduin Lothar, champion of Stormwind and Lane's oldest friend, who gathered the survivors and led them north, taking the young prince with him, assuming the role of guardian to a child who had just lost everything in a single afternoon. Stormwind fell, and an entire generation of Stormwind's people became refugees in Lordaeron, received with varying degrees of charity, defined permanently by their displacement. Their identity as a people became tied not to a place they inhabited, but to a memory of a place they had lost. There is a particular quality to that kind of grief. When people choose to leave a place for opportunity, for safety, for the horizon, they carry it with them in a way that remains largely intact. The memory is voluntary. It can be revisited or set aside according to the needs of the moment. But when a homeland is taken, when the choice is removed entirely, something in the relationship between person and place becomes fractured in a way that ordinary distance cannot replicate. The land becomes a wound. Every memory of it carries the specific weight of its loss. Northshire Abbey, Crystal Lake, the road between the farms, these ceased to be comforts and became, instead, the precise shape of an absence. People who had walked that road 1,000 times now had to remember what it felt like rather than feel it beneath their feet. And among those who made that journey north was a 13-year-old king in name only, raised in the court of Lordaeron, growing up knowing what he had lost before he was old enough to have fully understood what he possessed. Varian's childhood in Lordaeron was not without kindness. King Tyrannus Menethil provided something like a home, and in that sense, Lordaeron became the country of Varian's youth in a way that perhaps complicated his relationship with Stormwind itself. But the defining condition of those years was the knowledge of absence, not the absence of a parent, though Lane's death was that too, violently and without warning, but the absence of a place, the absence of Northshire Valley, of the gates of a city that was no longer his to walk through, of everything that had constituted the ordinary substance of a life that had been interrupted at 13 and would not be resumed until he was a man. One can only infer what that carries, but the records of his return to Stormwind after the Second War suggest something deeper than relief, something that might more accurately be called restoration. The reconstruction of Stormwind is one of the more instructive episodes in the recent history of this part of the world, and it is instructive precisely because it went wrong in ways that were entirely predictable in hindsight and entirely invisible in the moment. Following the Second War, after the alliance of Lordaeron drove the Horde back and Stormwind was reclaimed, the Stonemasons Guild was contracted for the rebuilding. Their leader, Edwin VanCleef, brought thousands of laborers to the ruined city, craftspeople and builders who worked for years through hardship and uncertainty, through collapsed foundations and scarce materials, and the particular desolation of working on a ruin that had once been someone's home. They built the Cathedral of Light. They laid the boulevards. They rebuilt the gates and the towers and the great canal that runs through the city's heart. They did, in other words, the unglamorous and essential work of making a homeland habitable again. They gave physical form to the memory that an entire displaced generation had been carrying through years of exile. And when the work was complete, the House of Nobles refused to pay them. The politics of the decision were tangled, as such things always are when powerful people need to justify something they know to be unjust. The nobles had run up significant debts expanding Stormwind's military presence through Elwynn and into Stranglethorn. There were competing claims about the quality of the craftsmanship, disputes over the terms of the original agreement, and, in the background, the machinations of a figure called Lady Katrana Prestor, whose interference in the matter would only be understood much later. But stripped of its political texture, the essential act was clear. The people who had literally rebuilt the homeland were told that what had been promised to them would not be honored. VanCleef and the stonemasons took to the streets of the newly rebuilt Stormwind in outrage. The riot that followed was dangerous and chaotic, and in the confusion, Queen Llane Wrynn, Varian's own wife, who had gone to the streets to try to calm the rioters, was struck by a thrown stone and killed. Varian's grief curdled into something much harder, and the stonemasons were driven from the city. VanCleef fled with the remnants of his guild into rural Westfall, where he eventually united them under a different name and a different purpose. The Defias Brotherhood that emerged from that displacement became, in time, a genuine criminal organization responsible for real violence and real harm. Extortion, assassination, the dispossession of Westfall's farmers, the construction of a warship in the dead mines meant for far worse. That is the historical record, and it should not be softened. But its origins were something more precise than ordinary criminality, the organized expression of what happens to people when they have given everything to rebuild a homeland and are then informed that the homeland is not theirs. When the thread connecting them to a community is cut not by war or catastrophe, but by a deliberate choice made by those who held the keys. This, too, is what Elwynn means when examined honestly. Not only the warm hearth and the familiar road, but the question of whose hearth it is. Who is permitted to belong to the warmth that an ordinary place generates over generations of human habitation? The idyllic surface of Northshire Valley exists in the same landscape as the desperate camps of Westfall, and the road between them passes through the decisions made by people who had power over who was welcomed and who was discarded. The Defias threat was not imported from outside the community. It grew from within it, from an act of exclusion that denied the basic claim of people who had earned their place through labor and commitment and sacrifice. A homeland is not only what it looks like, it is also what it chooses to do with the people who have built and maintained and defended it, and whether that choice reflects the values the community claims to hold. The texture of daily life in Elwynn has always been, in the most literal sense, the substance of human civilization made visible. I spent time in the region during a survey conducted under the auspices of the Explorers League, not for anything as dramatic as the recovery of a ruin or the identification of an artifact, but to document the agricultural practices and settlement patterns of communities that had maintained continuity across multiple periods of severe disruption. The brief was dry. The work turned out to be anything but. The East Vale logging camp, situated in the east of the region near the border with the Red Ridge Mountains, operated with the pragmatic efficiency of people who had understood for generations that the forest needed to be managed rather than simply consumed. The logs came down on a schedule calibrated not just to demand, but to the rate at which the forest could sustain itself. There was no formal philosophy at work. These were loggers, not scholars, just the accumulated practical wisdom of people who depended on a resource and had learned, sometimes through hard experience, what happened when you took more than it could give. To the south, the Stonefield Farm and McClure Vineyards maintained their old rivalry with a cheerful stubbornness that suggested neither family had any genuine intention of resolving it. The Brackwell Pumpkin Patch sat where it had always sat. The Westbrook Garrison, on the road toward Westfall, kept its watch with a seriousness entirely proportionate to the modest but real dangers of the territory. And in Goldshire, the Lion's Pride Inn offered what inns have always offered in every century and every corner of the world I have been fortunate enough to visit. Warmth, food, the specific comfort of a building that has absorbed so many years of human occupation and human conversation that it seems to breathe familiarity the moment you step through the door. There are inns in Stormwind that are grander. There are inns in Dalaran that serve better wine. But there is something in the Lion's Pride that those establishments cannot manufacture. The sense that the building remembers everyone who has ever sat by its fire and counts you among them. None of these things are remarkable in themselves. That, I came to understand, is precisely what makes them worth careful attention. The philosophical traditions of the Kirin Tor, where I spent my earliest years of study, tend naturally toward the abstract. Magic invites it. When you are occupied with forces that operate beneath the visible surface of the world, ordinary life can begin to seem like mere backdrop to more significant processes. I held something like that view in my youth, in the way that young scholars sometimes hold views that conveniently flatter their own sense of elevation above the merely common. What disabused me of it was not any single revelation, but the slow accumulated weight of years spent among ordinary people in ordinary places, recording the shape of lives that would never appear in chronicles designed to preserve only what seemed, to their compilers, historically significant. The bread baked in a farmhouse before sunrise, the particular sound of a mill wheel turning through summer water, the way a road becomes familiar not through conscious study, but through repetition, through the body learning a path so completely that it no longer requires the mind's participation. These are not backdrop. They are the actual substance of what civilization is made of. The great halls and the carved monuments and the formal proclamations are the visible surface, the part that preserves itself in stone, and therefore appears to posterity as the thing that mattered. But the bread and the mill and the familiar road are the foundation. They are what the stone is built on top of, and what the stone, when it falls, is rebuilt to protect. When soldiers fought to reclaim Stormwind after the First War's defeat, They were fighting for something that would have been very difficult to articulate in a speech. Not abstract liberty, not the honor of a dynasty, not a principle, the smell of a particular kitchen, the sound of a particular mill, the feeling of a particular road beneath their feet on a morning when there was no particular reason to notice it. These are not small things dressed in the language of importance. They are the actual content of belonging, translated into sensation and habit, and the deep grammar of a life lived in a specific place among specific people. Marshal Dugan, who maintained order in Elwynn's roads and fields during the years of my survey, said something I recorded in my field notes and have returned to many times since. He said that most people who caused trouble in the region were not evil, not in any meaningful sense. They were lost. They had no place that knew them, and without a place that knew them, they had no reason to behave as though their actions carried consequences that would outlast the moment. He was talking about bandits on the road, petty and opportunistic, but he was also, without intending to, describing something that extends far beyond Elwynn's borders, the pattern of what becomes of people when the thread of belonging is severed and nothing adequate replaces it. The Defias Brotherhood had begun as skilled craftspeople with an honest grievance. What they became was what displacement, combined with injustice, tends to produce. The cataclysm changed the face of Elwynn as it changed the face of much of the world. The fractures that Deathwing tore through Azeroth reached even into this quiet region. The cataclysm broke open a passage through the Elwynn Mountains, allowing Blackrock orcs to begin attacking Northshire directly, a threat so severe that Stormwind infantry had to be deployed there simply to hold the valley. The forest itself bore its own wounds, fires, collapsed pathways, the general disruption of a world that had been shaken at its foundations. The larger drama of the catastrophe played out elsewhere with far greater violence, in the Thousand Needles, swallowed by rising water, in Darkshore reshaped by forces that seemed almost contemptuous of what had been there before. By comparison, Elwynn escaped without being unrecognizable. But I find it worth noting that it did not escape entirely. There is a temptation, when thinking about catastrophe at the scale Deathwing represented, to focus exclusively on the dramatic transformations. The coastlines drowned, the valleys flooded, the earth cracked open. Those are the images that define the event in collective memory because they scale to the enormity of what was done. But the smaller disruptions, the broken mountain pass, the burned vineyard, the garrison stretched beyond its original purpose, represent something worth its own consideration. No place was exempt. The earth did not recognize the distinction between sites of cosmic significance and sites of ordinary habitation. And the people of Elwynn rebuilt. As they had rebuilt before, after the First War's destruction, after the stonemason disputes, after every smaller calamity that the years accumulate. As people in ordinary places always seem to rebuild with a stubbornness that, when observed across enough generations, becomes indistinguishable from something that might be called a philosophy of place. The Stormwind infantry held Northshire, the farms replanted, the abbey reopened. The ordinary fabric of life reasserted itself with the quiet relentlessness that, in the absence of any heroic narrative to attach to it, tends to go entirely unrecorded. This is not a small thing. It only looks small because it happens without ceremony and produces no monuments to itself. Endurance of this kind, the endurance of ordinary people maintaining the fabric of ordinary life, against the pressure of events that would prefer to unravel it, is perhaps the least celebrated form of courage that exists in the historical record. It appears in documents only obliquely, in tax rolls and trade manifests, and letters that were not written to be preserved. It is what happens between the named events in the years when history is not being made loudly enough to attract a chronicler's attention. And it is, I would argue, the form of courage on which everything else that matters ultimately depends. The heroism of the battlefield is real and worthy of recognition. But it defends something. The something it defends, the bread and the mill and the familiar road, requires its own form of relentless, unremarkable commitment to keep it intact. The candles in the archive have burned low. Outside, the city is quiet in the way Dalaran sometimes is in the deep middle of the night, when even the magic seems to be resting. I keep a small map of Elwynn on the wall beside my desk, not a formal document, but a sketch made during the Explorers League survey, rough and annotated in my own hand. The roads are not quite to scale. The Nazfariti bend slightly wrong. I made it for reference and practical navigation. Somewhere along the way, without any deliberate decision on my part, it became something else. Evidence, perhaps, of the way that even the most methodical attention can become a form of attachment. I return now to the question this record opened with. What gives an ordinary place extraordinary meaning? The answer I have arrived at, after many years and many miles, is that the question contains a quiet error. It assumes that ordinariness and meaning are separate categories. That meaning must be imported from somewhere external, conferred by proximity to the remarkable, earned through association with events of cosmic weight. That an ordinary place must justify its significance by gesture toward something larger than itself. Elwynn offers a different argument, one that I have found in the archives and the field notes and the imperfectly preserved letters of soldiers who knew they were dying. The meaning was always native to the place. It did not arrive with the Arathi settlers as some divine conferral. It accumulated the way soil accumulates, slowly, invisibly, through the repetition of ordinary acts performed by ordinary people who had no particular ambition to be remembered. The family planting vines they will not live to see in their best expression. The stonemason laying a road that will outlast his grandchildren. The soldier on a rearguard line watching smoke rise from a mill he would recognize blindfolded, holding the position because the people behind him need the time to reach safety. These acts do not produce legends. They produce the conditions under which ordinary life becomes possible. And ordinary life, carried on with continuity and care over time, generates precisely the kind of meaning that makes people weep at a familiar watchtower after years of exile. The extraordinary meaning of ordinary places is not a paradox to be resolved. It is the most direct statement of what meaning actually is. It is not an attribute of remarkable events. It is what accumulates when unremarkable events happen in the same place, by the same people, in the same rhythms, over long enough time. It is the product of continuity and belonging, and the deep human need to have a place that knows you, that you know in return well enough to bleed for it, well enough to rebuild it from rubble, well enough to carry it with you for years as nothing more than a memory and a specific ache when you see smoke rising from the wrong direction. Stormwind was rebuilt twice. It will likely need to be rebuilt again. The world does not tend toward permanence for places that matter to people. What survives the cycle of building and destruction and building again is not the stone. Stone is replaceable, as the stonemasons understood better than anyone, and as the city's noble families proved they did not. What survives, what has any chance of surviving, is the thread of continuity. The family that kept the same farm through 2 wars and a cataclysm, and the particular betrayal of being forgotten by the people they helped restore to power. The inn that kept the same fire burning. The road that remained a road even when everything around it had changed beyond recognition. Whether that thread is strong enough to hold against what the world will continue to demand of it is not a question I can answer from an archive in Dalaran. I can only note that it has held before, in circumstances that gave no particular reason to expect it would, and that the people who kept it intact were not heroes in any sense that the histories tend to celebrate. They were farmers and innkeepers and road wardens and stonemasons. They were people who had a place that knew them and who, in the face of everything the world offered as reason to abandon it, decided that was enough. I find, looking again at the sketch on the wall, that I marked every farm, every one, not because the Explorers League required it. I have never been entirely sure why I did it. Some forms of attention, once given to a place, do not withdraw.